Hi there, welcome back. So I've nearly finished a track that I'm actually fairly happy with. I think it's definitely a lot better than the first one I wrote. And I thought if I put out a video now showing how I made one of the main parts of the track, it would make me finish the track. It would make me win the battle against the perfectionist streak I have, because part of me has wanted to drop it, but I think on balance it's something that is good enough to finish. So this is the first in a short series of videos which will go over each key part of the track. And there'll also be a couple of videos in this series which go over the mixing and the mastering of it. It's deep house-ish, kind of, and I'm going to give you 24 bars of it now. One thing I just want to say is, if you're watching this video, and I know there's been a few views on previous videos, then thank you very much, because you're preventing me from wasting all the money I spent on getting myself a Mac Mini and Logic Pro. And actually it's a brilliant way for me to hold myself accountable, so I actually make use of it. And it's made me really enjoy making this music a lot more than I thought I would. So I really hope that any free downloads I give out are somewhat useful, and that the content in the videos is also useful for you as well. So I thought I'd start this series by looking at the pad sound that you would have heard underpinning that track in the preview there. I love making pad sounds. There's so many different ways that you can do it. The pad actually started out as a very basic drum loop, and this is what that drum loop sounds like. It's literally 2 bars of some garbage drum loop programmed in, and the quality of the drum loop and the groove doesn't matter at all. I'm literally after something that's just going to trigger one of the amazing impulse responses in Space Designer. In Space Designer you can find some brilliant warped effects and drone tones. There's a couple of dozen here. Now some of them are really good for some bizarre sound design, and others are actually brilliant for pads because they play a chord sound which can be used in a variety of different styles of music. I thought the preset I used here, Radiant Moment, sounded like it'd be perfect for deep house, hence the track. This is what it sounds like with that drone tone. A really nice, glassy, fresh sounding tone that it gives there. Brilliant for resampling. So I bounced down that 2-bar loop and I dropped it into Quick Sampler and looped a very small section here where the tail of the reverb or the drone tone carries on, and this is what it sounds like. It's quite a hissy, fizzy sound, but there is still that lovely that lovely sort of tail coming from the convolution. And I thought if I slowed it down, which was the first thing I did in the track, slowed it down, I think it was 15 on the coarse tuning here. Straight away it starts sounding a little bit more like a pad. Now, in this little project I figured adding a bit crusher was a good idea because it gives a few more harmonics to the sound. And then when you filter some of the harshness out of it, you get a much richer pad sound than you would with just EQ and filtering alone. So that was the raw pad sound, and I filtered it a little bit further in the main track, and I'll show you that now. Pad in the track, and this is the patch open on the Quick Sampler. So what I did when I dropped it in was the loop I kept at 3 beats. The reason being I wanted it to have some motion that really fit nicely in the track and matched the beat. So here's the raw sound, and you'll notice as well that I'm playing the sound you just heard in that small project, but I'm also playing the same sound an octave lower. I just thought the octave lower really helped beef it out a bit more, and it gave it gave the pad a lovely quality which sort of really washes over the entire track, which is what I was looking for. And it can be quite tricky to get that lovely wash of a pad that doesn't drown out everything, but I think this one just about does it. So, the plugins in sequence. There's just the pad, and again, like I said, I added the bit crusher and the channel EQ. Just some very basic channel EQ, as you can see, because the bit crusher brings in a lot of extra harmonics, some of which we want to get rid of. And the bit crusher is mildly crushing it. Good resolution, 6 times downsampling to bring in those sort of gritty top bits that you hear here. And then the EQ just gets rid of that harshness but keeps the warmth that the bit crusher brings. The next thing I did was, because you can hear there's that slight pulsing that's going on because of the length of the loop, you'll notice, and you can see down here, that it's not the smoothest sound it could be. And the way to fix that, or at least mitigate any of the sort of choppiness that might be in that pad, is obviously compression. So there's a fair bit of compression on here. There's a slow attack and a longish release. The ratio isn't enormous, but it's enough, I think, to really smooth it out nicely. There's also a bit of extra gain. In fact, I think it gave it a bit of extra volume, and I've also added the distortion here. And this was what I was looking for, a fairly smooth line with the worst of the peaks being squashed. There is, as the track goes on, a bit of modulation across this sound, because I think, although it's a fairly harsh sound, some of the top end bits work quite nicely almost in place of, say, a static sweep. So at this point in the track, there's not much going on, but because this sound is so rich, all I needed to do was, as you'll see here, bring up the high cut filter. So bringing up the high cut filter there, like I said, it brings in a lot of lovely harmonics, and I think it almost sounds as if something else is fading in on top of that nice warm pad. And that's why I've elected to keep the number of elements in this track quite low. This sound is so big that I don't need to add that many to it. Now, in the context of the track, I'll just give you a quick reminder so you can hear how everything works together, and then I'll show you how I layered another pad on top of it later in the track.
Our beliefs is your thoughts, emotions, and then our actions.
Okay, so later in the track, what I wanted to do was bring the pad sound back in. You'll notice, and as I'm sure you heard in the preview, there's a big contrast between sections of this track. There's the really sort of wet, washed out, reverb-y sounds going on in the build-up, and then when it kicks into the main sort of body of the track with the beat and the bass, the pads are stripped out, and there's just a nice sort of stabby sound in there. And I do that because I like tracks with a huge contrast between sort of wet and dry. It's something I think is very difficult to do well in a track, and this is by no means perfect, but it's the kind of music that I enjoy writing, and I also enjoy listening to it. When it's done well, it's awesome in any setting. So coming back to this section of the track, this pad comes back in, but I layered it with this one, which is very, very similar. It's just I'm playing it an octave higher. And there's another thing going on here as well. You notice that the length of this loop is 1 bar and 1 beat. So it sort of pulses against, or sort of it's syncopated to the pulse of the other pad. And I think that just helps again bring a nice bit of motion to the track. They come together in this build up here. And they give that nice big wash of sound that I'm looking for. The other thing I like to use this pad for in this track, and this wouldn't normally be the way I use pads, is just as an accent. Because of the way I've made the sound, there's not a long tail on it and there's not a very slow attack. It's also not drenched in reverb or delay or anything like that because the original sound was so rich that I didn't need to do that. And that's proved really useful in this track because I can use it for accenting as well as creating a nice big wash of sound. So you'll see what I mean in this loop here. So there it is, used as a bit of an accent as well as a big wall of sound. And I think it works quite nicely for that. It keeps it interesting, and later in the track I bring in a bit more modulation, which adds a little bit more interest again. And it's a big contrast to how I used to write tracks years ago, and I'm trying not to fall back into bad habits. I previously would have used synth pads, which I think is a brilliant way to make a pad sound, obviously, but then fed it through a lot of delay and a lot of reverb. Although that gives you a nice big washy sound, it's actually quite difficult to use in some ways because you might have a very long tail on the reverb and the delay in order to create that wash, but that means that when you change chords, they sort of bleed into each other and the music can get quite muddy quite quickly. So that's why I found I've really enjoyed making this pad. Using that looped sample gives you the best of both worlds. The one downside to it, obviously, is that because that sample is itself a chord, I can't now play new chords with it. However, you could probably build something from scratch in not too much time using a similar impulse response that wasn't a chord and feeding a similar sound through it and then layering them on top of each other. So I do think that'd be a way to get a really brilliant pad sound that you have a lot more control of than you do this one. However, for this track, this pad suits the purposes pretty well. So that's it for this video. The next one coming up is going to be on the bass and the kick drum. Thanks for watching.